To sew the bodice lining, place the two shear panels with the wrong sides together, pin one of the short ends, and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance down to half the width and then press to one side. Fold the shirring panel on the seam with the right sides together. Press neat at the seam and then pin and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance to one side and then top stitch at 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch from the previous seam line. On the long edge of the bodice lining for the shirring panel, fold the wrong sides together at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and press all the way across. And then we're going to fold again at 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Press all the way across, pin it in place. The bodice lining is now ready for shirring. We're going to hand wind the elastic shearing thread around a bobbin. Be sure not to stretch the elastic while winding it. Load the bobbin into the base of your sewing machine. It's very important to make sure that the elastic thread is looped properly through the base. If it isn't threaded properly through the base, then the elastic thread won't work. Increase your stitch setting to an extra long stitch length. Start sewing a row of shirring thread 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch below the bottom of the folded channel. It's important to sew with the right side up so that the elastic thread is on the inside of the garment. Sew all the way across the bodice lining to the end, and then sew the second row 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch parallel to the first row of stitches. To help your fabric elasticate and gather, you can place one finger behind the fabric that will assist it in gathering, and you'll see that it makes it extra stretchy. Sew parallel rows of shirring stitches until you have 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches left at the bottom. Fold the bodice lining in half with wrong sides together. Unfold the channel at the top and pin it flat, and then we're going to sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. After sewing the seam, you can trim down the seam allowance to half the width. Press the seam allowance to one side, then we're going to turn the bodice lining inside out, fold the side on the seam line, press, pin in place, and then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam to one side, then top stitch at 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Next, press the channel again over the seam allowance section where it may have lost the fold, double fold it, pin it in place, and then we are going to sew the channel. Edge stitch along the edge of the fold around the top of the bodice lining. If the fabric bunches up, just pull the fabric, hold it flat, and continue sewing along, adjusting it as you go. When you reach back to where you started, leave a 2-inch gap. That's where we are going to insert the elastic. Cutting the elastic, we're going to take our chest measurement and subtract 3 inches or about 7.5 centimeters. And then place a safety pin on one end of the elastic, and using the safety pin, insert the elastic into the channel of the bodice lining, and we're going to scrunch and shimmy it through until it reaches back to the opening, just like we did with the waist channels. Match up the ends of the elastic and overlap it by 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. Make sure that the elastic is laying flat and that it doesn't get twisted, and then we're going to sew on each of the ends of the elastic. And then you can pull on the bodice lining to get the elastic inside of the channel and sew it shut. I did do stitches on the upper part of the channel as well, but I wouldn't recommend it because it made it a little bit too narrow and it was difficult to get the elastic through. My girls that love the pockets and dresses, this step is for you. If you're not doing the pockets, you can go ahead and skip forward to the skirt construction. Using a zigzag stitch or a serger, we're going to finish the top straight edge of the pocket and around the curve. If you're sewing with a zigzag stitch, you want the needle to hit the fabric on the left side and then to go over the edge of the fabric on the right side so that it encases any fraying of the raw edges. Align the pocket to the skirt with the right sides together and pin in place. Match up the notches or measure from the top down on the side seam 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. Sew the side seam with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance and repeat this step for all 4 pocket bags. Using a zigzag stitch or a serger, finish the raw edge of the skirt and pocket bag all the way down the side seam. Finish the top edge of the skirt panels as well with a zigzag stitch or a serger. We're going to be gathering this section and it tends to fray a lot. Fold the pocket piece away from the skirt and press the seam allowance flat. We're going to top stitch the seam allowance to the pocket bag with a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Lay the skirt pieces flat with right sides together and align the side seams. Pin in place with the pocket bags matched up, and then we're going to sew down the side seam around the pocket bag and all the way down the side seam to the hem. When you reach a corner, sink the needle, raise the presser foot and rotate the fabric around the needle, then lower the presser foot and continue sewing. You will do this at all 3 of the corners. Lay the skirt pieces and the pocket flat with the front side facing up. Press the seam allowance flat. The seam allowance and pocket will be toward the front of the skirt. If you're sewing your skirt without the pockets, you are going to finish the side seams with French seams, just like we did with the bodice lining. First, sew with wrong sides together with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then trim the seam allowance in half. Press the seam allowance flat and turn the seam allowance to right sides together and press flat. Sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance and then open it up and press the sides flat again with the seam allowance pressed toward the back of the skirt. Fold your skirt in half, matching up the side seams to find the center front and the center back. Mark on the front and back of the skirt with a pin. Then we are going to sew all the way across the top of the skirt with a gathering stitch. Increase the stitch length on your machine and increase the tension. On the front side of the skirt, sew a gathering stitch 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Do not backstitch at the beginning or the end and leave a long tail of thread for gathering. Sew a second gathering stitch parallel to the first one at 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. After sewing the 2 rows of gathering stitches from side seam to side seam on the front side, repeat on the back side of the skirt. Fold the bodice lining in half, matching up the side seams, and mark the center front and the center back with pins. Place the bodice lining inside of the skirt with wrong sides together. First, we're going to match up the side seams and pin in place, and then you can match up the center pins. After that, adjust the gathers until the width of the skirt matches the width of the bodice lining and pin all the way around the skirt. Adjust your stitch and tension settings back to standard settings and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the skirt. Lightly press the seam allowance up toward the bodice lining. Then we're going to turn the bodice lining inside of the skirt so that the right sides of the fabric are matching. The bottom section of the bodice lining that doesn't have any shirring stitches is what we're going to use to wrap around the seam allowance of the skirt. As we work our way around the waist seam, we're going to be adjusting the bottom section of the bodice lining to wrap around the seam allowance and enclose the raw edges. Then we will press and pin. Next, we will sew as close as we can to the stitch line. This will enclose the raw edges like a bias binding, and it will secure our gathers. Take this step slowly and adjust the gathers as you sew. Sew all the way around the waist seam. Press the seam allowance up toward the bodice lining. To anchor the pocket to the waist seam, pin the upper corner onto the waist seam and back tack well. Next, we are going to secure the waist seam line by top stitching with a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the hem of the skirt 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch with wrong sides together. Measure, press, and repeat all the way around the hem. And then we are going to fold it a second time at 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Measure, press, and pin all the way around the hem. Sew the hem with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. At this point, your bodice and your dress are both complete, and you can keep them as two separate pieces to be able to style them separately. After wearing it several times, I've found that it's more comfortable if the two pieces are sewn together. So I like to add a few tacks in the back. Here I'm going to align the very bottom of the second waist channel to the waist seam of the dress where the bodice lining meets the skirt. Here I'm going to pin it in 4 or 5 places, and then we're going to sew 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch tacks at each of those pin markings. This will help to secure the sheer lining to the bodice so that it doesn't slide down or fall down, especially if you have pockets in the dress that could weigh it down a bit. This will help to keep it up and secure and in place. If you feel like you need extra security, you could also add a second band of elastic under the bust. And this is the very final step. Your dress is complete. Beautifully done. Your Haven dress is ready to wear. I hope you enjoyed the process of sewing this garment and wear it for many years to come. If you would like to tag Maiden Mary Designs on Instagram, I would be overjoyed to see your finished garment.